Hello, everybody. So as a result of some weird stuff, we're not going to be able to have classes this week, so I'm going to be recording our lectures. And you guys are free to watch these at whatever time you'd like. You can watch them during our normal class period or just whenever. But you will need to watch them. Next week, we will be having another discussion, this time on nationalism and revolutions. And of course, these lectures will be crucial for crucial context for those discussions. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about the kind of conservative status quo in Europe from 1815 to 1830. And then we'll be looking at the first big wave of revolutions during the 19th century, which is the revolutions of 1830. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. We got a lot of details to wade through today. So first of all, kind of before we get started, let's talk about some kind of conceptual stuff here. First of all, before I get into this slide, we're going to be talking a lot about the different political ideologies that we talked about last week and the week before. Specifically, we'll be talking a lot about the political tensions between conservatives and liberals. The revolutions of 1830 are very much liberal revolutions, also oftentimes flavored with a lot of nationalism alongside it. So what we'll be seeing is a tension between kind of old school monarchist conservatives who want to keep kings in place and keep these like multinational empires together. And on the other hand, we'll be seeing a bunch of liberal nationalists who are calling for national unity, constitutions, constitutional monarchies, representation for rich people, free market economic reforms, stuff like that. Socialism is not going to play a major role in the revolutions of 1830, in spite of the fact that we're seeing growing class divides as the Industrial Revolution spreads from England to the continent. All right, so with that in mind, let's now talk about kind of the general framework for how these revolutions go. A revolution requires more than just an angry mob of poor people. If all you have is an angry mob of poor people, you get riots, you get revolts, you do not usually ever get a successful revolution. And the reason for this is that oftentimes the angry masses lack any kind of coherent ideology, or they lack the organizational skills to unify and direct the mass anger into a politically sustainable direction. So you need three things in general for a revolution to work in Europe, and maybe for a revolution to work today if you're interested in that sort of thing. So the three things you need are you need a bunch of angry poor people, the mob. You need some kind of coherent ideological justification for the revolt. And you need a political class that is willing to channel the energy of the masses and to lead it into some sort of organized political structure. It's kind of interesting to apply these categories to the recent Capitol insurrection. We definitely have angry masses. Do we have an ideological justification? Do we have a political class willing to lead? We can debate that in our discussion if you'd like. Now, okay, so how do you get these three elements? So it's pretty easy to get angry masses when most people live pretty close to utter poverty. The easiest way to get an angry mob in the early 19th century is crop failures. And crop failures still happened fairly regularly, just because of like fluke weather occurrences. And if this happened, if much of the crop was destroyed or damaged, food prices will spike. And for poor people, especially poor people living in the cities where they have to buy all of their food, life all of a sudden gets way harder, and some people are faced with the real prospect of starvation or at least chronic malnutrition. And this makes people angry. This happened before the French Revolution in 1789, the OG French Revolution. This is going to happen again in 1830 and 1848. Increasingly, as the Industrial Revolution progresses, another source of instability is going to be introduced, and that is an industrial slowdown or a recession. because then people will lose their jobs in factories or wherever, and then they will once again be faced with the prospect of real starvation because so many people are living so close to the subsistence level in these early 19th century cities. Another thing that can lead to an angry mob is the systematic oppression of a minority group. So this happens a lot in the more eastern states in Europe, so in Prussia, Austria, and Russia, especially Austria. There's going to be a number of national identity groups who are going to feel that they are being not being represented and being oppressed by the ruling by the government. So, for example, in Austria, the government is basically dominated by Germans under the Habsburgs, but the Austrian state is composed of almost a dozen different nationalities. You've got Italians, you've got Hungarians, you've got Czechs, you've got Slovaks, you've got Croatians, you've got Ukrainians, you've got Jews, and all of these groups are feeling oppressed because they basically are run by a German monarchy. And that's going to lead to a number of serious incidents going forward. Also, one other thing that could really lead to a revolt is an unpopular or failing war. This will happen in 1917 in Russia, in the Russian Revolution. So anyway, those are some ways that you can get angry masses. In 1830, the big one's just going to be a serious crop failure, plus some nationalist groups who feel like they're not getting what they deserve. Second, you need an ideological justification for your revolt. In 1789, this was Enlightenment ideas, John Locke's ideas of human rights, Rousseau's idea of the social contract or the general will. In 1830, the ideological justification is going to be, in every case, some combination of liberalism and nationalism. People are going to be demanding constitutions and a state that represents the national identity group that they belong to. In 1848, socialism is going to enter the mix. And in 1917, in Russia, we're going to see a full-blown Marxist revolution. And last of all, you need a political class that is willing to lead. These are people with the organizational skills and connections and money to make it all happen. The working class usually doesn't have very much money or social connections or organizational skills like journalism and finance and legislation, legal abilities and stuff like that. So it's almost always in the 19th century the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are feeling dissatisfied with the status quo, and they are then going to use the angry mob to overthrow the existing government. And then they're usually going to try and put in place a government that suits their needs, and that may or may not suit the needs of the angry masses. This is going to happen in 1830. The masses are going to overthrow a government because they're hungry, and they're going to end up just putting a bunch of rich bourgeois liberals in charge. And those rich bourgeois liberals are then going to say, oh, well, it's natural for the masses to be hungry because that's how the market works. And so people are going to feel quite dissatisfied with this outcome in many cases, and that helps to explain why there's another wave of revolutions just 18 years later in 1848. So anyway, those are the three things you need for a revolution to happen. Angry masses, ideological justification, and a political class. So today, in 1830, we're going to watch liberal nationalist bourgeois lead angry mobs of hungry people to overthrow governments and then install liberal governments that support the bourgeoisie. Sweet. Here we go. Before we get to the revolutions, we need to talk about the kind of status quo in Europe. From 1815 to 1830, basically Europe is a very conservative place. Almost every government is a conservative monarchy, doing their very best to prevent revolution, and they are going to fail. One of the main political agreements, which we've already mentioned, is the Congress of Vienna, which resulted in all of the major powers being governed by conservative monarchies. In France and England, you have constitutional monarchies, whereas in Prussia, Austria, and Russia, you still have old school, divine right, Louis XIV style monarchies. All five of these great powers have agreed to an international peace, sometimes called the Concert of Europe, in which they agree to avoid going to war with each other, to settle disputes through diplomacy, and to avoid upsetting the balance of power. The last thing that any of these monarchies want is another destructive war, because they feel like a destructive war would then unleash the forces of revolution, which they're all terrified of. Remember, the French king got his head cut off. So, if there is a revolution, the members of the Concert of Europe have also agreed to intervene to prevent revolution from occurring. So if any of these monarchies looks like it's going to be overthrown, the great powers will step in to squash it, or at least that's the agreement. Now, one other issue that resulted from the Congress of Vienna was that territory was sort of arbitrarily distributed based on population and economics and military strategy. And there was almost no attention paid to the identities, that is to say the national identities of the different groups. So some examples of this include the Netherlands. The Kingdom of the Netherlands was created by joining the Austrian Netherlands to the Republic, the Dutch Republic. And then this was turned into a monarchy. And this is weird because it's combining territories that used to be united under the Habsburgs, but then the northern territory broke away and became Protestant. They also spoke a different language. They speak Dutch. In the southern territories, which will eventually become Belgium, France is the primary language spoken, and Catholicism is the major religion. But so the great powers, when they combined these two territories together, they didn't think at all about the identity of the common person, because remember, nationalism was still kind of a brand new thing, and nobody realized how powerful ideas of national identity would be. And so very quickly you start to see the French-speaking Catholics feel resentful that they're now being ruled over by a Dutch-speaking Protestant king. And so there's going to be problems there. Another big problem is that Austria retained large parts of Italy. You'll note here that this big northern chunk of Italy, which includes the major cities of Milan and Venice, is part of Austria. And these Italians, who are also starting to think of themselves as Italians, not just as subjects of this or that king, are going to become increasingly resentful of the fact that they're ruled over by a German guy living in Vienna. So that's also going to be a problem. And one last destabilizing factor is the fact that industry is progressing throughout Europe. Especially in Britain, this is a destabilizing factor at this time. Britain's Industrial Revolution is already in full swing. Everywhere else, the Industrial Revolution is really just kicking off, but you're already starting to see urban overcrowding, very, very visible poverty, and incredibly bad living conditions in the larger cities of these territories. And this leads to people talking about the social question. And the social question is basically, what should we do with all the poor people living in the cities? And the liberal answer to the social question is, can you guess? Don't do anything. What about the conservatives? What's the conservative answer? The conservative answer is also don't do anything. So you've got a bunch of angry poor people living in the most important cities in all of these countries. And so that, combined with the national minorities feeling oppressed, are two of the long-term factors that all these governments are going to have to deal with. So the big architect of the conservative order, as we've already talked about, is our boy Clemens von Metternich. There he is. He kind of single-handedly engineered the Concert of Europe. He also came up with this principle known as the principle of intervention, which I already mentioned, which is that if there ever is a revolution, all the other great powers will intervene to prevent it from succeeding. Prussia, Austria, and Russia are all about this. They also just fully embrace absolutism and refuse to accept any modernist changes at all. In France, you have a constitutional monarchy under the Bourbons. Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII, comes back out of exile and is put back on the throne, or is put on the throne for the first time. And Louis XVIII, in his heart of hearts, wishes he could go back to the old school French absolutist model, but he understands that this is dangerous, and he accepts a sort of limited constitution with wealthy people able to vote and a constitution. Although he doesn't call it a constitution, he calls it a charter that limits his authority in various ways. Right, cool. And then Britain still has their classic parliamentary system with a fairly weak monarch. But it's important to remember that Parliament is run only by wealthy individuals, either wealthy landowners or wealthy capitalists. And so the British government basically refuses to take any action to deal with the increasing levels of poverty and squalor in British cities. So there are a number of sources of instability. I've already talked about how liberalism is a growing source of instability. Um, but it is important to recognize, especially since they're the major players in the revolutions of 1830, the main things they want are checks on monarchical power, representation for wealthy people in the government, and economic reform that will make it easier to industrialize. And so this would include kind of investing in infrastructure and adopting certain financial institutions like central banks that would make it easier to pool capital and then begin investing in large, heavy industry. Another big source of instability is nationalism. Again, I've already mentioned this. One other thing that is also leading to some instability during this time period is a number of revolutions on the edge of Europe or outside of Europe. So in the 1820s, there is a wave of revolutions in South America and Mexico that results in serious problems for Spain, but also demonstrates sort of the continuing force of revolutionary ideas. So people who are disappointed with the outcome of the French Revolution are now looking across the Atlantic and seeing all of these South American countries declaring themselves to be liberal constitutional republics. And then a lot of people in Europe are like, all right, that's what we need to do also. There's also going to be a nationalist uprising in Greece that is going to set an example for other nationalist groups in Europe. And last of all, the economy in Europe is not doing great from 1815 to 1830. As often happens, there's a post-war slump, like lots of stuff has been damaged. And also governments aren't just pumping money into the economy with, wartime demand. And so a lot of people lose their jobs. And you start to see some very early socialist movements stirring around by 1830. So we're going to start by looking at the countries that actually don't have revolutions in 1830. These are the countries that more or less succeed in keeping control of their territory and maintaining a sort of conservative government. This is a kombucha, by the way, not a beer. Now, see, look, kombucha. But anyway, so one country that basically successfully avoids revolution forever is Great Britain. Great Britain had their one revolution, the English Civil War back in the 1600s, and that's it. Or I guess the Glorious Revolution counts also. Fine. But so Britain at this point is basically done with revolutions. And how they're going to do it is they are going to very slowly change their system to co-opt the people who would lead the revolution. So rather than denying the rights of the bourgeoisie and the liberals, they're going to slowly just accept the liberals' demands. And then the liberals will not side with the angry masses, and then the government can work together to crush the angry masses and force them back to work. There's two big sources of tension in Britain. One is the wealthy capitalists who are making money during the Industrial Revolution demand more power. They demand more say. They demand a reform within Britain to fix a number of serious political problems. And then there's also increasingly angry and increasingly organized factory workers in Britain's major cities. So what Britain is going to do is they're just going to give the rich middle class almost everything they want. Um, um, sorry. So it's going to take a little while, but eventually what's going to happen is they are going to abolish a number of serious problems that the middle class is upset about. So the two problems that they're upset about are the Corn Laws and misrepresentation of people in Parliament. The Corn Laws are simply a tariff on grain imports, which makes food more expensive, but then helps wealthy landowners who grow corn, that is to say, wheat or barley, not actual corn, um, who grow wheat or barley and feed the cities. So this helps landowners, but then makes stuff more expensive in the cities and therefore hurts the profits of the industrialists. Eventually, Britain's going to repeal these. And then also, there's a serious problem with how parliamentary seats are distributed because there's no mechanism for redistributing representation based on population change. And so for the last couple hundred years, the seats in parliament have stayed the same, while some towns have totally disappeared and other towns have popped up. So for example, there are some territories known as rotten boroughs where literally nobody lives except like one landowner. And obviously he votes for himself and then becomes the representative in parliament, even though he doesn't represent anybody. On the other hand, the city of Manchester has basically popped into existence over the last couple hundred years and is now one of the major industrial centers in Britain, and it receives 0 representatives in parliament. This is obviously not fair, and what's eventually going to happen is the parliament is going to reform this, and they're going to recognize that this gives an unfair advantage to old-fashioned landowners, and they're going to give Manchester and other industrial cities more representation and get rid of some of these empty boroughs that still have votes. So they're going to give the rich people, the rich industrialists, basically everything they want, and then they're going to smash the heads of the workers. In 1819, there is a massive demonstration in London calling for better working conditions, better wages. And essentially what happens is Britain just deputizes most of the wealthy people in London and tells them to go out and smash the heads of the workers until they go home. So the London army and the bourgeoisie of London come out and basically crack down on the workers until they leave. Yeah, so that's Britain's strategy, and it's going to work. They're going to avoid revolution. In Austria and Prussia, we see two absolutist monarchies, and they basically apply similar strategies to preventing any kind of revolution. This is only going to have limited success. So in both places, there are liberals and nationalists who dream of creating a unified Germany. Now, this is weird because Germany, remember, is divided into, at this point, like 60 different little states, dominated by Prussia in the north and Austria in the south. Now, the thing that's weird is that both Prussia and Austria have big chunks of them where the people living there are not German. So both of them have big chunks of what used to be Poland. And then Austria also has tons of people over here who are, Hungarian or Czech or whoever. So how can you create a unified Germany without destroying Austria and Prussia? It's not clear that you can. So anyway, during this time period, there's increasing support for some sort of constitutional German monarchy. This is especially popular in the universities, where student clubs or fraternities start churning out sort of idealistic nationalist young men who dream of having a real German fatherland that they could belong to. There's also lots of dissatisfied people, national minorities like the Poles and the Hungarians who feel unrepresented by these monarchies. And the response of both Austria and Prussia is to simply crack down in the most authoritarian way they can manage. They increasingly fund the military. Uh, they um, they rely on a powerful, loyal state bureaucracy to get stuff done. They begin funding a massive secret police effort to seek out possible revolutionary cells, to shut down revolutionary presses. They have serious regimes of censorship. Anything that references the French Revolution in any sort of positive way will be shut down. And also, they invest very heavily in the church and in education. Prussia especially funds the university system very well and ends up turning out generations of very patriotic thinkers. German philosophy during this time is also very highly patriotic. One of the leading philosophers during this time, who was actually promoted to be like the head philosopher in Prussia, was a guy named Hegel, and he argued that the Prussian state was actually the perfect embodiment of God's will on earth. And so it helps you to understand maybe how he got promoted, given that the universities were run by the Prussian state at this time. So anyway, some combination of repression and brainwashing hopefully would prevent these ideas from spreading too much. You're going to see that it doesn't work. But not in 1830. In 1830, Prussia is going to basically be fine, and Austria is going to be fine everywhere except in Italy, where they have a harder time controlling what's going on. And last of all, and most conservatively of all, is Mother Russia. So Russia has basically almost no exposure to Enlightenment ideas except in the most elite circles before the French Revolution. Catherine the Great styled herself an enlightened monarch. She wrote letters to, like Voltaire and other philosophers. But really, most Russian people were more or less uninterested in these ideas. This changes after the French Revolution, because Russia ends up marching all the way to Paris and occupying Paris. And what this means is that there's now thousands of intelligent young men, these officers, living in Paris and learning about the ideas of the French Revolution, the people they just beat. And a lot of them start to say, hey, you know what? That all actually makes perfect sense. So a lot of young officers come back with liberal and nationalist ideas inspired by the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Also, there's a lot of young, highly educated people with no real serious prospects for a good job because those are all dominated by the nobility. These guys become known as the intelligentsia, and these young, intelligent, ambitious people with basically no way forward in life begin to call for some kind of political change. And last of all, there's also the problem of Poland. Russia now controls most of Poland. See, here it is right here. This is Russian territory. That's the old Polish heartland. The Poles briefly had their independence under Napoleon as the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. But now they are more or less controlled directly by the Tsar in the most authoritarian manner possible. And so the Poles are going to try and change this using violence if necessary. In response to these various sources of tension, the Russian Tsar, a guy named Nicholas I, refuses to compromise on anything. He says, I'm picked by God, you have to do what I say, and we're not changing anything. As part of this kind of total intransigence on Nicholas's part is due to the fact that on the very first day of his reign, he faced what appeared to be a possible military coup. This was the Decembrist revolt, or sometimes known as the Decembrist massacre. The Decembrists were groups of liberal army officers who were hoping to get a constitution out of Nicholas I. And on the very first day of Nicholas's czardom, they organized outside of the palace in St. Petersburg as a way of basically registering their desire for some kind of constitution. Now, seeing a bunch of officers arrayed in military kit right outside of the palace is a little frightening, and so Nicholas responded by calling in army regiments that were loyal to him and opening fire on them and just mowing down his own officers. And he started out not compromising, and his whole 30-year reign, he did not compromise at all. He funded a secret police to hunt down possible revolutionaries and then exile them to Siberia. Russia has a long history of exiling people to Siberia. He also invests heavily in beefing up the state bureaucracy and the military, and invests in censorship. So basically, he applies all of the same strategies as Austria and Prussia. So whereas Britain is willing to accept change and is willing to change its system to co-opt new elites, especially the industrial elites, Austria, Russia, and Prussia basically just say no to everything. And this is going to set them up for revolutions in the future, because these groups who now feel like they've basically been denied political authority are going to turn to revolutions as a way of getting what they want. All right, now let's get to the actual revolutions. So the first big revolution in 1830 and in 1848 is another French Revolution. There's a phrase that became common after the revolutions of 1830, which is that when France sneezes, all of Europe catches a cold. Because what's going to happen here is the French revolutions are going to be the first revolutions in this wave of revolution, and they are going to kind of kick off the revolutions in other parts of Europe. So what was going on in France? So France was actually kind of liberal for most of the time after the defeat of Napoleon, up to 1830. So from 1814 to 1824, Louis XVI's older brother, or younger brother, Louis XVIII, and yes, I guess they were both named Louis, rules as Louis XVIII. He's a constitutional monarch with a chamber of deputies who write the laws and stuff. Yeah. So unfortunately, Louis XVIII dies without an heir, and so his younger brother, who was always an old school absolutist style monarch, ascends to the throne and becomes Charles X. Charles X attempts to restore absolute monarchy, and he does this in a number of sneaky ways that we don't need to go into. And the Chamber of Deputies continually resists Charles X's efforts. Charles X keeps trying to introduce laws that will basically give him total power, and the Chamber of Deputies continues to thwart Charles's efforts. So while this is going on in 1830, we're also seeing a poor grain harvest that's leading to high grain prices in Paris and other major cities. And while that's going on, Charles just decides to get rid of the Chamber of Deputies. He just dissolves it. And he says that the king doesn't need representatives and he can just do whatever he wants. He also then begins passing a number of very, very reactionary laws known as the Four Ordinances, which is basically set up just to make sure that only the most conservative old aristocrats will have votes that count. It also allows for massive censorship of the press and the ability to just kind of redo elections if he doesn't like the results. So basically, at this point, liberalism is dead in France if they allow the Four Ordinances to go through. What happens is that, though, in July, there is a spontaneous mass protest in Paris. And this happens for a number of reasons that I don't want to go into. But there's a massive uprising in Paris. The poor, hungry mob takes over the city, and Charles is forced to flee Paris and eventually to flee the entire country. When this happens, the liberals, who were members of the Chambers of Deputy, put themselves forward as the representatives of the people. So the angry mob has just overthrown Charles X because they're hungry, and now the liberals are going to come forward and say what people want is a constitution and free market economics. So the liberals are going to emerge as the leaders of this revolt and turn it into a real revolution. And they're going to call for Charles X's relative, a different branch of the Bourbon family. They're going to call for this guy, Louis Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, to become the next king. And the reason that the liberals want this guy is he himself is a liberal. He is a liberal king who fully supports real constitutional government. So the liberals are basically going to get everything they want. Charles X is gone. They're going to put this guy on the throne, and they are going to now get the sort of free market, constitutional, liberal regime that they always wanted. More people are going to be allowed to vote, but it is still an incredibly small number of people. Less than 1% of the population is able to vote in this new government. So it basically is good for the liberal bourgeoisie in France, and it doesn't address any of the problems of the crowd. The masses who were hungry are going to remain hungry, and so it's not going to be long until we have another French Revolution on our hands. Now we've got a number of other smaller uprisings or revolutions that occur around Europe. So one big one is the uprisings in Belgium. So the Belgian Revolution is going to result in the split of the Kingdom of Netherlands into the Netherlands and Belgium. Yeah. The main reason for this is the main ideological reason for this is one of national consciousness, as the Belgians are beginning to think of themselves as a unique people who speak French and are Catholic, as opposed to the people who run the government, which are the Dutch, who are Protestant. There's also increasing liberal sentiments among the urban elites in Belgium, as there is pretty much everywhere. There's a food shortage, just like there was in France. And all of this combines together to lead to an open revolt. Now, remember, according to the Concert of Europe, what should happen is all the major powers should go in, should crush the revolt, and then give the land back to the Kingdom of the Netherlands, because that's the whole setup, is to work together to crush revolutions and make sure they're not successful. This is exactly what Prussia and Austria and Russia wanted to do. They wanted to roll in, crush the Belgians, give the territory back to the Dutch government, and go home. Now, France and England both resist this. One reason that England resists this is they think that an independent Belgium will be a much better trading partner. Also, there's some family ties between England and Belgium that I don't want to go into. So anyway, because France and England end up supporting the revolution, this prevents Germany and Austria from intervening because they don't want to start a war. And so this allows Belgium to gain their independence. But it comes with a catch. Belgium has to declare basically permanent neutrality in any future wars, which means that Belgium won't take a side, but also that nobody will invade Belgium. But of course, the Germans eventually do end up invading Belgium in 1914. So anyway, that's the Belgian Revolution. Here's a split of the different language groups that are spoken in the Netherlands. So here's Dutch up here, down here is Flemish, and then down here is French. Yeah, so anyway. Another major nationalist uprising that's also combined with liberal ideas is the nationalist uprisings in Italy. So one of the big things is that Northern Italians have kind of a distinct identity of themselves as Italians, and they don't like being ruled by Germans. There's a growing sense of Italian unity. Part of this is from the French Revolution, where the borders got all scrambled. But also they were introduced to this whole idea of having a glorious nation that represents you and stuff like that. Italian elites are becoming increasingly liberal. And as a result of all of these three things, there are a couple provinces in northern Italy, centered around Milan and Venice, who declare themselves independent from Austria. This doesn't go anywhere. The Austrians send in an army, they totally crush the Italians in a number of battles, and they restore order. But this does result in an ideological breakthrough. One of the leaders of the revolts was a guy named Giuseppe Mazzini, and Mazzini starts a movement called Young Italy. And the idea here is that they're going to actively spread Italian nationalism throughout the Italian peninsula, trying to lay the groundwork for future revolutions. And just to let you know, there will be future revolutions. 1848 in Italy is going to be nuts. All right, another example of a nationalist uprising is in Poland. So Poland was divided between Prussia, Austria, and Russia, though most of it is controlled by Russia. Poland also had memories of being independent during French rule, and there's an increasing sense of national identity among young Poles, especially because they're more or less now ruled directly by the Russians, and the Russians aren't necessarily ruling them with the lightest of touches. And the Poles start to say, why are we being ruled by this foreign power? We're a great nation with an illustrious history of goofing off and not really having an effective government. And we want to get back to that. And so all of this combines to a violent uprising in 1830. The rebels have some initial success, but ultimately Russia just steamrolls them. So many Poles who are captured are sent into Russian labor camps in Siberia. Many Poles go into exile, including one of the most famous pianists of the period, a guy named Frédéric Chopin, who goes to Paris. But so the Poles at this point are crushed, and hopes for Polish nationalism are going to have to sit around and wait for some major changes. So those are three big nationalist uprisings. There's another weird one that happens, and it's not really during 1830, but it's worth talking about, which is the Greek War of Independence. Greece has been trading a lot with Western Europe, and many of these Western European ideas have ended up filtering into the Greek merchant class. The Greek merchants also send their kids abroad to be educated in Western Europe, and so they're bringing back liberal and nationalist ideas. As a result of these liberal and nationalist ideas, the Greeks rebel against the Ottoman Empire, which has ruled them for like 300 years at this point. And the Ottomans respond in the most brutal way you can imagine, just massacring populations of people in areas where the revolutions broke out. Now, Western Europeans seeing this have a kind of weird, like, pro-European response. It's maybe not even nationalist so much as like Western or maybe pro-white. I don't know. But for whatever reason, the Western Europeans view the Greeks as this like part of Europe that's being oppressed by the Turks. There's a number of famous artists and poets who get involved with this, including the British Romantic poet Lord Byron, who actually goes to Greece and then dies of illness there as an attempt when he attempts to get involved and fight in the Greek War of Independence. So anyway, Western Europe supports this, and Russia fully supports the Greeks. And the reason that Russia fully supports the Greeks is it gives them an excuse to go to war against the Ottomans. And Russia has always been wanting to take over Ottoman territory to control the Black Sea and potentially get a port on the Mediterranean eventually. So it looks like Russia is about to roll in and just take over huge chunks of the Ottoman Empire nominally to help Greece. France and Britain are worried that Russia is going to do this, so they also intervene. And they say, all right, Turkey, give it up, give Greece up, or else all three of us are going to come in and we're going to wreck you. And so rather than allowing Russia to steamroll the Turks and get a lot of territory, the Ottomans just give up and they give Greece its independence. So in 1832, Greece becomes independent. They're given a brand shiny new monarch who actually is German. I don't know why that makes any sense. This prevents Russia from expanding into Turkey, which annoys them. And this is really an early test of the concert of Europe, because basically what was happening is Russia wanted to cheat. Russia was trying to expand its power, which might have thrown off the balance of power in Europe. But everybody intervened to support the revolution. That way it wouldn't happen. Also, interestingly enough, the absolutist power of Russia totally supports the revolution when it's in the Ottoman Empire, even though they totally oppose revolution in any other state. So it's almost like they don't really consider the Ottoman Empire to be a legitimate government in the same way that the other states in Europe are. I've already mentioned the British unrest in the previous slide, so I don't want to go into it anymore. Yeah, so don't worry about this. So now, those are the different revolutions that have occurred, or that occur in 1830. So in general, the liberals in the West, that is in France and England, get what they want. They get constitutional monarchy, they get representation for rich people, and then they start to get the sort of financial structures and policies in place that make free market capitalism easy. There is zero attempt to address the concerns of poor people in the West. Liberalism simply doesn't have the ideological mechanism for justifying any kind of intervention for the sake of poor people. If you'll remember correctly, liberals like David Ricardo argued that poverty is just a natural result of economics. That's just how it works. Now, in Central Europe, in Italy and Poland, these uprisings totally fail. So the Italians and the Poles are going to be burning for another opportunity to seize their liberty in the future. Also, we have Belgium and Greece now on the map as independent nations thanks to the nationalist uprisings there. So some of the significant takeaways from the revolutions of 1830 is that the concert of Europe, even though it's strained by Russian ambitions to take over Ottoman territory, is maintained. The concert of Europe holds. All the major powers are still cooperating with each other, more or less. There's lots of groups who are totally unsatisfied with what just happened, including workers in the West and liberals in the East. This is going to lay the seeds of resentment for the next set of revolutions. And last of all, there's a growing divide in the political culture of Eastern and Western Europe. So France and England are moving further and further towards just full liberalism, constitutionalism, industrialization, whereas Prussia, Austria, and Russia are all kind of resisting these changes and attempting to turn the clock back to Louis XIV style absolutism. All right, so anyway, that's the revolutions of 1830. In the next video, we'll cover the revolutions of 1848. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope I did a good job of kind of wrangling these details in a way that wasn't oppressive for you. All right, so anyway, I will see you guys next week. I hope you enjoy this video, and take care.